Well, I'm delighted to welcome Ralph Nader here. He is, I've been following in his footsteps since college when I was a Nader Raider. In 1969, we all trooped to Washington by the thousands. I think they paid us $500 for the summer. I can't tell you we changed the world, but we certainly changed the Forest Service, which I was assigned to because we were running all over the Forest Service every day. They'd never seen young people so interested in forestry. And we also changed the Veterans Administration. We were spending a lot of time taking a look at how Vietnam veterans were being treated when they returned. We wrote a book about that called The Discarded Army. Ray Bonner, who you may have heard of if you know the New York Times. Paul Starr, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning professor at Princeton today. So Nader represents something to those of us from that generation, which is the profound impact that citizen action can have on history if you can get people involved and willing to volunteer. None of this is really profitable, lucrative. It doesn't pay for itself except in terms of the satisfaction one gets at a higher level than anything else you'll ever do by getting involved in ordinary street action, activism, not in political parties, but in effecting change by finding out what's going on, doing your homework, working with other people, and not shutting up about it. That's the most important thing. Now today, we don't have anything like that, as far as I can tell. I mean, I know my two young ones are involved in startups, and they're working on, their careers. And lots of young people at Yale that we're seeing here today are studying hard, working on these issues. I would love to see revival of the level of activism that we saw in that period. And I'm not sure what's missing in order to ignite that. But Ralph is here today, I think, to talk a little bit about his work over the years. Nobody's had a bigger impact in terms of regulation, in terms of law, in terms of citizen rights, all the many things he started in this world on illicit financial flows. He was the guy who proposed country-by-country reporting for the first time in 1977, a book on Citibank. A lot of people have claimed credit for it later on, and they've refined it, but it was Ralph's idea. And I think that's just one of thousands of ideas, and he has not stopped. He's on my case this week about how we're going to fight this terrifically horrific Trump tax bill that's just been planned. I'll tell you a little bit about that in my presentation. We talk about the fact that it's an effective repeal of the corporate income tax for major multinationals. So without any further, nobody needs less of an introduction than Ralph Nader, so I'm not going to stand and say anything more, but I'd like you to give him a very warm reception because he's traveled all the way here, and I think, again, we've kind of let him down a little bit with the size of the audience, but I think your enthusiasm can overcome some of that. So, thank you, Ralph.
Can you hear me without a PA? Yes. Can you hear me all right? Okay, thank you very much, Jim. He's got a lot to say on this forthcoming tax bill in Congress and possibly $800 billion bonanza for global corporations, so I hope you'll stay. I'm looking out over this room in this great university with thousands and thousands of students and faculty, and suddenly I spot all these empty seats. Now, if the corporations were dedicated to sexual harassment only, you could fill 1 million seats. Sexual harassment, slurs on gender, race, just words, right? Just words. Let's talk about brutal deeds. It's not that corporations don't harbor sexual harassment activities or discrimination on race, etc. It's just they're not overt about it. They're too clever. And seeing these empty seats makes me ready to quote from a very brilliant speech that was given with no fanfare in 1987 at an anthropology class at University of California, Berkeley, by Gordon Sherman. Gordon Sherman was the head of Midas Muffler. He made it into a national franchise with Midas Muffler shops all over the country. But he also had a Sherman Foundation, Gordon Sherman Foundation, which gave grants to, at that time in the 60s and 70s, some pretty fundamental, they would often be called radical action groups. And he was asked to give an address to the students on controlling processes of corporations. And in a wide-ranging speech, think of the relevance today. This is 1987, so it's even more relevant today. The corporate controlling processes, I'm quoting now, the corporate controlling processes in society can be summarized in one little two-word phrase. How does a corporate process control society? The phrase is universal complicity. Universal complicity. By making society submissive and abject in its acceptance of much of the mischief of the corporations and their inherent irresponsibility. That's where we miss the point. If as liberals we point to the corporations as something separate from ourselves, there isn't one of us that hasn't participated from the time we brushed our teeth to this moment here today in some act of complicity in participating in this whole sweep that the corporate world has made possible. In driving here, using the lights, anything that has to do with the environment, even before you get to wasteful practices or evil. So the corporate juggernaut is part and parcel of our way of life. We're swept in it. We're all on it. If it is a juggernaut that no one can stop, partly it's because there's no one out there to lean against it. We're all aboard. We're implicated in the whole corporate cycle, and our name is consumers, employees, stockholders. It's really all different manifestations of one general thing. End quote. You look at your cell phone, you buy from Amazon, you breathe the air, you drink the water, you go to school, you go to the marketplace, you go to the entertainment places. Corporations uber alles. Commercialism uber alles. For 2,000 years, every major religion warned its adherents not to give too much power to the merchant class. Why? Because in the singular monomaniacal drive for profits, the merchant class does not allow enough room for other values, civic values, health, safety, forms of respect, opportunity, etc. That's why they said don't give too much power to the merchant class. It's so highly motivated to pursue a commercial objective that it runs roughshod. It will engage over the years and decades and centuries in slavery, in serfdom, in massive poisoning of human environments, and destruction of habitats, and exploitation and wasteful practices that it loads on innocent people called externalities, and in the process produce a lot of wealth, a lot of production. but doesn't produce distribution of that wealth or production without the rule of law, without other forces that are countervailing to the driven objectives of ever larger corporations. Other forces basically saying, you will not have slaves, you will not have child labor, you will respect the environment. And the corporations being expedient, if they see they can't get away with it, that they're going to be prosecuted, they're going to be fined, they're going to lose their subsidies, they're going to be exposed to reputational damage, sometimes comply. Sometimes they comply permanently, like there's no such thing as legal slavery anymore in the US. But they're always fighting to drive back the forces of power that espouse civic and humane values. They never stop fighting, even though they have to comply. And so I think it's important, before we give brief descriptions of the corporate crime wave, to show how corporations over the centuries have become so dominant. What are their tactics and what are their strategies? One cannot do anything more than summarize some of the types of categories conceived mostly by brilliant corporate attorneys, many of them graduating from Yale Law School down here and Harvard Law School. We have to respect the incredible creativity of these corporate attorneys, driven by their own commercial pursuits, to get away with what they get away with almost no publicity, and to get away with what they get away with without losing much sleep at night, because they have an ideology that sandpapers their conscience and tells them that everybody deserves an attorney. Everybody deserves zealous representation. These corporate attorneys are rarely studied. As we speak, Harvard Law School is celebrating its 200th anniversary. They have over 24 sessions today on all kinds of subjects. 24 sessions on all kinds of subjects. None on corporate crime. None on corporate tax evasion. None on corporate law firms. Ideologies tend to dislike reality, because reality undermines the empirical starvation of ideologies, which come in many forms, not just communism, socialism, capitalism in their rigid forms. They come in educational forms as well. So let me explain, or remind many of you here, that the corporate entity, as we now know it, the modern corporate entity emerged in Massachusetts in the textile industry in the early 19th century. The background was, of course, was the great British Crown corporations. I say great because I mean large, like the East India Company or the Hudson Bay Company. They were really extensions of the British Crown Empire. But the modern corporation was legislated by Massachusetts, where they gave a group of investors a charter. And so corporations are not created by investors, they're funded by investors. Corporations are created by the state, by the government, that gives them a charter that has been elaborated into enormous privileges and immunities and impunities at this time. But when it started out, the legislators in Boston were nervous. What is this thing called a corporation, a legal fiction? How can we empower it without it becoming, as Justice Brandeis noted in a Supreme Court opinion in the 1930s, a Frankenstein in our midst? How can we give it the right to engage in contracts and to raise money and to speak out? Well, they didn't give them many rights. They gave them a charter. The charter only allowed them to do business in the specified area, like textile manufacturing. They couldn't do business in any other area. The charter prohibited them from buying any other companies or investing in any other companies. The charter was limited in its duration, say 10 years, renewable on good behavior. So you can see the lawmakers held on to a tight leash here. But the corporations and their lawyers figured, now that we have a foothold, let's go to the races. And in the 19th century, they got rid of the ban on investing or owning other corporations. They got rid of the 10-year or the limited term. They got rid of any kind of good behavior standard. And after the Civil War, there was further expansion of the charter. And other states chartered, and they came into competition with one another. And Delaware won it. First it was New Jersey with a very permissive charter, allowing the boards of directors and the officers to pretty much run the show. But Delaware thought that they could get state revenue. Indeed, at one time, almost a third of Delaware's revenue came from these fees of chartering corporations. And many corporations ran to Delaware from other states to get chartered, including the largest corporations we know, like General Motors, of course, DuPont, large New York banks are chartered in Delaware because of the permissiveness of the law itself and the permissiveness of the judicial interpretation. When I was at law school and I took my corporations course, we had all these Delaware cases. So I raised my hand once and said, "Professor, this is a small state. Why are there so many Delaware cases?" And he said, "Well, don't you understand that there's a chartering law in Delaware that corporations find more permissive and more facilitated?" Indeed, over the years, General Motors could have bought Delaware if DuPont was willing to sell it. That's how amenable the political interests in the government in Delaware was. Now, after the Civil War and into the 20th century, they were off to the races. The first principle of a corporation is limited liability for the investors, to encourage the investors to put money in without having to lose everything that they own if a corporation goes over the cliff. They would just lose the money they invested. Now, would you believe that if you add up the corporate immunities and privileges, we have a scene in 2017 where these global corporations have now achieved limited liability for the corporate entity itself. And it doesn't just come in the form of workers' compensation or the Price-Anderson Act, which immunizes beyond a modest sum corporate liability in case of a nuclear power catastrophe, an electric company, for example. It comes in many ways, and I'd like to point out some of these ways, because when you see how corporations expand their power, whether it's legal or custom or political influence or what have you, you see the ways that the opposition to this power can intersect and intervene. So you don't just see this corporate blog with a great logo plastered on your TV set or your Facebook or whatever ads you access on the internet. And here are some. They have acquired some of the sovereign immunity of government. For example, a defense contractor like Boeing or Raytheon or Lockheed Martin, if they produce a fighter plane that's defective, ordinarily under product liability law, you could sue for the injuries, or the next of kin could sue for the fatalities if the plane crashed. But now the corporations say, we are contractors of the Pentagon, and we have absorbed the sovereign immunity from such suits that the Pentagon has. This is still being worked on in the courts. There's some wiggle room, but that's an example of the kind of impunity that develops with very little discussion or political attention. Another one is called government guaranteed capitalism. This is where you have government contractors who basically cannot lose, because there's always the golden handshake from the government to make up for it. Or you have actual statutes that say, if Sally Mae lends money to millions of students at an atrociously high government-approved interest rate working with the banks, and the students default, the government makes up the difference. That's government-guaranteed capitalism. You have a situation which is called corporate bankruptcy. Now, if you individually go bankrupt, very little of your assets are protected. Maybe your home, maybe your tools, but pretty much you're shredded until you got another 7 or so years if you have to go bankrupt. Again, you're rendered pretty poor. You don't get a retention contract. You don't get a retention bonus. You don't get to live another day. Meanwhile, you're under bankruptcy. You're still selling. You're still making profits. But corporate bankruptcy, it has now evolved, again, the brilliance of corporate lawyers, has basically viewed bankruptcy as an intermission, where as you continue producing and selling products, you get rid of your creditors and you get rid of your litigation, even if it's litigation for the loss of life and limb, such as litigation against General Motors that was filed before General Motors rendered bankruptcy. Unlike human beings, General Motors split itself into two formats. The old General Motors was loaded up with the debt. It was going to be extinguished because it was broke. And ahoy there, the new General Motors with $30 billion plus of your money, shorn of its creditors and shorn of its litigation. The government was too embarrassed not to take stock in return. So the federal government took 60% of the stock of General Motors. The Canadian government took maybe 10, 15, 20%, and UAW, United Auto Workers, took the rest. And here's where another corporate impunity kicks in. Do you think that the government shareholders ran GM? You think they told GM to speed up in pollution-controlled cars, in pushing for public transit, in dealing with climate change, in respecting their consumers in auto finance? Oh no. They basically had a new board of directors that didn't have anybody in the government there, and government and GM resumed business as usual. And under the Obama administration, the government decided to sell its shares at a loss, not even tapping into the existing treasury that GM had made up of government tax bailout dollars. Law professors call corporations a legal fiction. The word fiction even extends to what they get away with. You can barely believe it. They have peddled the American dream to tens of millions of Americans. And as a bumper sticker in Berkeley pointed out, the American dream, the only way you can believe the American dream is to be asleep. But that's the propaganda, which is another example of how they maintain their reputation, no matter how many criminal acts they maintain. Look at Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo is a premeditated criminal enterprise. There's nothing vague about it. It's one of the biggest banks in the world. And they decided to push for more profits. They told their workers on the QT, open up credit card accounts, sell auto insurance to the customers who bought a car, and don't tell them about it. Just bill them. We're talking about several million of these criminal deceptions, several million involving their customers. And this went on for years. How many people knew about it? Thousands of people working for Wells Fargo knew about it. How could they all shut up like that? How come a few just didn't speak out? Quit. Fear, retribution, lawsuits, and complicity. They knew they would be accused of being complicit. Fear, dread, impoverishment, blacklisting. That's quite an aura of immunity for systemic, multi-year corporate crime, is it not? But today, in California and elsewhere, millions of people are doing electronic and personal business with Wells Fargo. Complicity. Used to be easy to change your banks. It's now harder than ever. They actively discourage it, and you're so intertwined that it's easy to procrastinate it. And what bank are you going to go to? You're going to go to a bank, if you think about it, that is too big to fail. Because a small bank may go bankrupt, you may lose your money, or it'll be inconvenient even if it's under the FDIC $250,000 cap. You go to a bank that's too big to fail and too big to jail. And they know it and behave accordingly. And they're doing today, in many ways, what they did before the Wall Street crash, speculating with other people's money, multi-tiered derivatives, not disclosing risks, conflict of interest, putting people in innocent funds, pension funds, mutual funds, individual investors in shaky investments that they themselves are avoiding. Impunity and immunity. You combine the two, it spells corporate insanity. And institutional insanity is never studied in our revered citadels of higher education. They study mental health and individual aberrations. They don't study the institutional insanity of private and public organizations who behave in ways which, if imitated by an average family, would consign the family or some people in the family to mental institutions. For example, and I have to use psychological language here, the drug industry is a kleptocracy. It's constantly being caught by the government. They avoid criminal penalties. They have to pay $1 billion, $2 billion in money, pushing unapproved uses for drugs, pushing drugs that actually create the disease that the drug is sold and represented to prevent it, like Vioxx. And you can get many more of it by going to the Health Research Group of Public Citizen. Super documented. So the drug companies are a kleptocracy. And It is never viewed as a mental health problem, an institutional mental health problem, which would, of course, incur different levels of response from an organized, sane society. The opioid epidemic is the result of systemic corporate crime by a number of companies pushing it in higher and higher doses through their distributors, through their salespeople, covering up contrary studies, challenging anybody who tries to counteract them with all their entangled influences in public and private forms of decision. You have hospitals now who get women who give birth, they want to get them out in a day or two. That should be called attention deficit disorder on the part of the hospital. You have General Motors who for years resisted dumping its pollution in your lungs from its under-engineered cars and over-polluting factories. What would that be called? That would be called a company that has systemically failed to toilet train itself. So, what do law schools do about this? Until recent years, they never had a course on corporate crime. It would be called white-collar crime, namely a bank teller cheating a bank, not a bank cheating a customer. How touching. These law professors at Yale and Harvard are the best and the brightest. If you don't believe it, all you had to do was ask them. How touching that they knew nothing about the corporate crime waves in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. Why they would go out of law school, maybe law review, and they'd go to work in a corporate law firm. Hardly an arena of innocence. They knew what they were doing. You can see what happens to the serf mind, the submissive mind that Gordon Sherman talked about, the complicit mind. The business schools, they now have some courses, seminars on corporate crime at a number of universities. They even have a couple case books. They have managed, however, not to make it a required course. The world is awash in corporate crime. I'll get to that in a moment. Its manifestations are not just corporate. They have corrupted and enslaved their emissaries and representatives. They have indentured otherwise highly respected institutions like universities. What would business schools do? Law schools don't make these courses required. They say to third-year students, oh, you're interested in corporate crime, here's a seminar, we have 15 slots. The business schools develop strategies for business. They show how advertisers can be more clever, one might say, deceptive. They show how marketing can be more penetrating. They show how you can evaluate your trademark and capitalize it. They show new ways of financing. But they don't show how to make corporations behave. They don't develop strategies for investor-owned and controlled corporations. They don't deal with the spectacularly maneuvered separation of ownership from control that Burley and Means pointed out in the 1930s in simplified fashion. The corporations are owned by individual investors, mutual funds, and pension funds, and other trusts, and university endowments. But they are controlled by officers of the corporation, boards of directors, and other often hidden allies. How can this be? These corporations are supposed to be part of the capitalistic system, but they systemically violate the basic principles of capitalism. Number one, if you own property, you should have reasonable control over it. Jettisoned. Corporate capitalism doesn't obey that. Number two, if you're not doing that well in the marketplace, you're obliged to obey the verdict of the marketplace. And if necessary, accept the verdict of bankruptcy. False. Corporate capitalism has ways of generating eternal life without the candles and the music. Capitalism principle number three, that if you are in competition with other competitors, you don't play dirty tricks. You play by the rules. So if you're being beaten by a smaller company that's getting bigger market share, you don't go to Washington for a bailout or for a guaranteed loan or for some policy that will disadvantage your competitors. Done all the time by corporate capitalism. Indeed, their franchise agreements are so singularly controlled one way that it's almost impossible with contracts of non-competition, etc., for any of their franchises to break out and start a competitive business. They have all corners covered. The ability to escape jurisdictions. This is where Jim Henry will give you some interesting details. I was down at the Grand Cayman Islands a couple years ago. Anybody here been at the Grand Cayman Islands? There's a nondescript building. It's like 6 stories, and it doesn't smile. It has a few shrubberies around it. And in this building, there are thousands of shell corporations registered by the Grand Cayman Islands authorities. And the door opens into a foyer, and people walk in and out with briefcases, constantly, out, in, out, in. These are subsidiaries of Citigroup, subsidiaries of AIG, subsidiaries of European and Japanese and other corporations. For what purpose? Well, you can use either word, tax evasion or tax avoidance. They are there also to escape accountability in other ways, not just economic, not just tax. They are there to demonstrate that they have no loyalty to any country or community other than the jurisdiction that allows them to achieve the greatest profit with the minimal countering rule of law. The jurisdiction that facilitates their pollution, their bribery, and their other machinations against workers and some of their institutional investors who don't even know what they're doing. The distance is so great between ownership and control. The empty shell corporation itself has undergone spectacular manifest changes and flexibilities. And most economists are totally clueless, and most corporate lawyers can hardly keep up. The creation of derivatives and where they are based is so complex now, with so many algorithms, that in a recent conversation I had with one of the creators of the option market back 50 years ago, told me that he cannot keep up and even understand what's going on. He relies on his 29-year-old mathematician genius assistant. This is the level of abstraction. As the level of abstraction gets more abstract and less empirical, it becomes more lethal a tool of control over reality land. Because the fewer people understand what's going on, the less feedback there is from the mass, from the audience, from the constituency. That's why corporate secrecy is so treasured by large corporate strategists. Now, in these remarks, I'm not talking about small business. The difference between small business and global corporations is not just one of scale, it's one of kind. It's not just one of degree. It's a completely different kind of animal, the giant global corporation, for reasons which we all know. Now, what else do corporations have to evolve in terms of controlling process? They have to control media. And so they become more and more concentrated in media ownership. When Ben Bagdikian, the professor of journalism at Berkeley, started writing his book on concentration ratios of media, the first book was about 55 corporations controlled over 80% of magazine, newspaper, radio, and TV numbers. And the second book came out, and it went down to like 30. And the third book came out, went down. He finally quit when he reached 10. It's now down to 5. And they're driven by the same commercial instincts, the same commercial censorship, the same commercial frivolity in terms of what they put on our property, the public airways. How many Yale students, you think, in the last 30 years, turned on Saturday network TV, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, in order to see how these companies are abusing the property jointly owned with others by Yale students? Show me one who has, and I will show you a visitor from Mars. This is the complicity. The complicity comes from growing up corporate. It comes from when you're 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, and you're watching the kiddie shows that show you with great mass psychology how wonderful it is to eat junk food, to drink junk drink, to increase your weight, to watch violent shows, to participate in watching violent shows. These corporate electronic child molesters know no bounds, even though they may teach Sunday school in some city around the country. But growing up corporate means that you're watching hundreds of thousands of advertisements which begin to characterize your view of the economy, which is the corporate view. They characterize an economy that is full of excitement and joy, sensual pleasure, pleasurable sound and light, tasty food, comfortable clothes, toys, an economy that is open for opportunity. If you play by the rules, you can become rich. An economy that knows no dark side, but a bright future and a luminous horizon. By the time we get to high school, they now put screens in front of us. We're told to become computer literate before we become literate, before we become civic literate. And so the cog in the giant corporate wheel is forged millions of times in secondary school, colleges, and graduate school. The universities have to be controlled. Now, none of this is total. The genius of corporate power, it is, in most cases, except in certain African mines and other places of work, it is not totalitarian. It is authoritarian, with heavy shades of complicity that make people think that they're agreeable to this. It's fun. Like Facebook, like Google. Whee! It's free. Amazon. Hey, the convenience is fantastic. I don't have to talk to anybody or brush shoulders in the supermarket pretty soon. It'll all come to my home. And though it's a bit of a drag to have these packages outside when I'm not around, Amazon now wants to have an electronic key to my home. I know that would never be misused. There'd never be burglaries, assaults, invasion of privacy, hacking. So why not give Amazon's delivery person, who will soon become a drone, an electronic key to my home? Yesterday's New York Times. Complicity. Universities, consultantships. A lot of law and business professors are teaching students by day and consulting with the corporations by night. It's interesting to see how an antitrust professor in that role can be true to the ideals of academic integrity and freedom. They do it by joint ventures. Drug companies, joint ventures with the University of California, Berkeley, right on the campus. MIT, right on the campus. Whitehead Institute, with roles that would never be allowed years ago, including passing on faculty nominations. They do it through alumni contributions. The alumni are usually corporatists. And they do it through curriculum shaping and incentives for certain curriculums. And I just pointed out, no corporate crime in legal curriculums for decades. When they talked about 19th century law, in my casebook on property law, the main asset for the southern part of the US, the main economic asset was slaves. The main litigation between plantations and between sellers and buyers of families and children and mothers and fathers was slavery. This property textbook, property law, was this thick. There wasn't one single case, either at the trial level, at the appellate level, or at the Supreme Court level on slavery. Talk about censorship. How would they sell their casebooks to Southern law schools if they had cases on slavery? It was an unmentionable. And the students graduated without any knowledge of that in the law of contracts and the law of property. Now there are two pillars of private legal freedom left: the law of contracts, the law of torts. We don't learn about them in high school or college. How strange. They were imports from medieval England. They're considered the two pillars of freedom in a democratic society. This is not public law. This is not criminal law. This is the law that you can use without asking anyone's permission. That's why they're called the two pillars of private law. In theory, that is what the law says you're supposed to be able to do. You enter into contractual negotiations with another party, then they negotiate. You bargain. You say yes and sign, both of you. And you're mutually obligated, and that is enforceable by the state in a court of law. But it starts out private. If you don't agree, you walk away. Freedom of contract. Conservatives love to talk about it and never defend it. Because now we've lost it. 99% of all the contracts we'll ever sign are fine print contracts, standard form contracts, ever more draconian against consumers and tenants and homeowners and patients in hospitals than they were 50 years ago. These contracts are drafted by corporate lawyers who are shutting the corporate door to the courtroom. They are shutting the door to the courtroom by saying to you, you have to go into compulsory arbitration if you're wrongfully injured by a corporation or cheated by a financial institution, and you cannot go to court. And the fiction of consent has allowed more judges than you can count to approve that one-sided contract and shut the courtroom door to trial by jury. What a government cannot do to us in our country, lock the courtroom door, the corporate contract has done to tens of millions of Americans. Corporate controlling process. They even have a provision, this lends to late night TV satire. They have a provision in a lot of these contracts called unilateral modification. And what it says is that the airline can change the terms of your contract unilaterally without you being able to do anything about it. You've agreed to it because in the fine print when you bought the ticket, you agreed to the unilateral modification clause. Now you'd think all those law students who went to law school strapped by Sally Mae contracts would be defended by their contracts professors, their brilliant contracts professors. Not a one in 50 years raised the issue publicly and took up the cudgels for the law students residing in their class about to enter years and years of contract servitude and peonage. Self-censorship is the mother or the father of censorship. Without self-censorship, you need censorship. Without censorship, all you need is self-censorship. Academic science and corporate science. Monsanto is swarming over the universities to preserve its corporate science against academic science that might challenge its scientific basis for genetic engineered projects. And so corporate science is secret science. It is not peer-reviewed science. It is proprietary science, and it has a political juggernaut attached to it all the way to Washington. That's Monsanto, corporate science. It will intimidate academic scientists. It will threaten lawsuits against them. It will fund scientific studies to come out the right way. Do you realize the impact on our society when corporate science dominates academic science? Do you realize what it means for military weapons systems? Like tens of billions of dollars down the drain on the missile defense program for countering interballistic missiles in midair, emphasize intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's corporate science. That's suppressive science. That's leaving us with one MIT professor, 10 postal, to challenge the lies and the fraud in testimony before Congress to no avail by the high military and corporate officials from Washington to Raytheon. Do you realize what it does to the safety of our medicines? Do you know how many tens of thousands of Americans die because of the side effects that are not disclosed and are approved because of corporate science and influence over the Food and Drug Administration? About 2,000 a week, medical journal-based studies. Corporate crime from the healthcare industry is now being tallied up. There will come a day when the argument will be, does the healthcare care industry kill more people than it saves? Although you hear about 9/11 and 3,100 dead Americans in that massacre, again and again, do you hear about 5,000 Americans who die every week? Repeat, 5,000 Americans who die every week from preventable problems and abuses and malpractice in hospitals. Who says so? You should always ask somebody, who says so? A May 2016 study, peer-reviewed by Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, done by doctors. That was their most conservative figure, 250,000 dead Americans due to preventable problems that range from criminal cover-ups to negligence to hospital-induced infections and so on. That's not a political issue. It was a one-day story in the New York Times and Washington Post. Nobody's campaigning on it. Nobody's having congressional hearings on it. Do you know how many congressional hearings that have been conducted on Benghazi? You see how the corporate trivialization connects with political ambitions? All right. I'll just do a couple more of that, and then I'll show how easy it is to turn it around. One more is corporate contracting with the government. Now, this is an area where you get the beginnings of what we should have as a new political movement. It's called the Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State. The Freedom of Information Act, the best in the world, was a product in Congress of a left-right alliance. Conservative and liberal members of Congress. The 1986 False Claims Act was sponsored in the Senate by Senator Grassley, conservative Republican from Iowa, and Howard Berman, conservative Democrat from California. It went through. The Whistleblower Protection Act, blowing the whistle on corporate fraud by government employees, went through in 2013, left-right alliance. Corporate contracting, hundreds of billions of dollars with the US government, until recently, was as secret as you could be. Then a bill passed to require a summary of each contract above a certain minimum, $100,000 or so, to be put online. And now there's a left-right effort to put the entire text of these contracts so they can be studied, challenged competitively, prosecuted against, exposed by the media, you name it, online. But until we reach that point, the corporate state, which is what the ultimate goal of corporate power is, the merger of giant corporations with giant government power in service of giant corporations, a very mature corporate state, but it always involves further refinements by the corporate attorneys. The corporate state is cemented in this massive outsourcing of government functions that is illustrated by the criminal war in Iraq being outsourced to companies like Blackwater, and the Army's defeat itself and it outsourced to huge expense to companies associated with a Houston corporation, etc. So what have been the responses over time to curb corporate power? Well, you know them. Adverse public opinion, embarrassment on 60 Minutes, government regulation, litigation in the courts, some shareholder resolutions by organized nuns and other shareholder owners of conscience, consumer advocates, environmental groups, the usual civic response using the three branches of government, congressional hearings, class actions. They're losing ground on all fronts to the juggernaut of creative suppression by giant corporatism. They're losing ground. We could not have gotten through the auto safety, the flammable fabrics, the product safety legislation, the air and water pollution laws, the gas pipeline safety laws. We couldn't have gotten these through today. You couldn't even get hearings today in Congress. We got them through because we had enough members of Congress who knew where they came from and wanted to do right by the people had hearings. The press reported them because it was official source disclosure. Their advertisers couldn't wrap their knuckles so easily as if they just reported a report from some private citizen group. And the pressure came on and the legislation was enacted. We got legislation in 9 months from zero starting point over one of the most powerful industries in the country in 1966, the auto industry. 9 months. Takes decades now to do something like that. So the response should go in this. You first need comprehensive corporate reform that subordinates the corporate entity to real life people under the Constitution. So you get rid of corporate personhood. Corporations and their corporate lawyers have gotten decision after decision giving the corporation almost all the constitutional rights we have, except the right of self-incrimination and a couple others. And that gives them a huge power position vis-a-vis real people. So first is, in the Comprehensive Corporate Reform Act, you have a stripping of corporate personhood, the subordination of the corporate entity to the sovereignty of the people. The Constitution does not mention once the word corporation or company. So why did they dominate us? Because they have been transferred into corporate personhood and achieving all the rights we have: free speech, the right to lobby, the right to give politicians money, etc. That has to be changed. We're not talking about people in the corporation. We're talking about the corporate entity should be stripped of those constitutional rights. And the second is the growth of local economies that displace giant corporate sales. We have tens of billions of dollars of local economies, community banks, credit unions, farmer to consumer food markets, renewable energy locally produced, community health clinics, etc. That's what we call the displacement economy, which should be given much more attention. The best magazine on that is Yes Magazine out of Seattle, Washington. Now, the approach has to be comprehensive, and we don't have time to flesh out, let's say, the comprehensive corporate reform law. But it also has to be piecemeal. And so all these forays that I've just discussed need to be parsed and countervailed, one by one. It may surprise you to know that the academic world can perform a huge role here with just a few professors. For example, take a few business professors in a few business schools, and their job is, how do you give investors more power? They're the owners. How do you give more power over their hired hands, the board of directors, and the corporate offices? You create a penny brigade. Penny brigade? Trillions of dollars of corporate power, you're talking about a penny brigade? What do you mean? Well, you develop a structure which is premised on the following. There are trillions and trillions of shares outstanding of the largest 500 corporations. If you persuade enough shareholders, they can be individual shareholders or a small pension fund or maybe Vanguard or whatever. Watch the arithmetic here. If you persuade shareholders of 20 billion shares in these companies to contribute a penny per share, you can imagine in a nanosec, they lose $1 on some of these shares, right? A penny per share per year. You have a pot of money that is how much? Go ahead. Come on, you got good scores on your SAT. What's a penny per share of 20 billion shares? Huh? Okay, 200 million, right? right? Okay. Is it 200 million? Okay. With $200 million, you can hire 500 experienced monitors representing shareholders to monitor and connect with other groups, every corporation. This monitor would be pushing sitting duck changes in corporations because you have all the shareholders on your side. Dividend, when Google doesn't give any dividends, or Cisco until recently. I tried this out, by the way, and I got Cisco to give a dividend. Got on cable TV, etc. You have the shareholders behind on stock buybacks, which can be shown by Harvard Business School reviews, articles, etc., to be like burning money. It's totally unproductive. It just meets a compliance criteria for the compensation package of the top bosses so they can get higher stock option values, etc. Doesn't produce anything productive at all. It should go into R&D, dividend increase, higher salaries or wages for Walmart workers, productive equipment, investment, etc. Now, is that a difficult thing for a few Harvard or Stanford or Yale School of Management to get together on? They would get cable TVs full of empty spaces. They have business shows. They're desperate for this kind of excitement. The one way you can get through corporate censorship is through going after boredom. They can't have bored audiences. How many times can you give the Dow Jones, boring? The penny brigade is just one example of the kind of simple creativity. Now, historically in our country, it has never taken more than 1% of active citizens representing popular opinion and having knowledge to change things around the country. Not more than 1% have brought the corporations via Congress to heel on many consumer changes and environmental changes, worker safety changes. Not one mass movement in this country, not the women's suffrage movement, not the labor movement, not the farmer populist progressive movement in the late 19th century, not the more modern movements of women's rights, civil rights, gay, lesbian rights, consumer rights, ever drew on more than 1% of the people, spending 300 to 500 or more hours a year connected with one another on the decision-making form that registers the change. That's the triumvirate. It's 1% or less with X number of time, certain contributions, with knowledge, representing public opinion, focusing on what? What is the one institution that could reverse a lot of what I was talking about here? It's called Congress. 535 people put their shoes on every day like you and I. Congress, the most powerful branch of government. Congress that could break through the media. Congress that could enact the legislation. Congress that could override presidential vetoes. Congress that could set the stage for judicial action. Congress that could give us parallel civil legal action to parallel the corporate criminal law enforcement. What does it take? Less than 2,000 people organized in every congressional district with a few full-time people representing them, laser beam focus, not in the ether after a mass demonstration on a weekend in Washington when Congress isn't there. Laser beam focus on your 2 senators and representatives, which you summon to town meetings of your location and your agenda. Now, is that too much? Let me tell you how much human energy that is. To change global corporatism around and develop a thorough democratic society. requires less human energy that is now expended on playing the game of bridge. If you don't believe it, get a copy of the American Bridge Association magazine, and you will be astonished and overwhelmed with the contests, with the rigor, with the study, with the training, with the meetings, with the convocations, with the honorifics of people playing bridge. So what I'm calling for is for people to play democracy, a slightly more important claim on the human spirit and the human mission, today, tomorrow, and for posterity. And how do you deal with all the billing fraud? How do you deal with all the financial crimes? How do you deal with the product hazards? How do you deal with the oncoming horrors of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and biotech, which can have some alleged benefits, but it doesn't allow themselves to have many mistakes, does it? It's like the launch of a nuclear warhead. You can do perfect control for years. Doesn't allow for one mistake. How do we do this? By our higher estimate of our own significance as students. Drop the cell phone. Stop the text messages of unctuous trivia, and pay attention to the future of yourselves, your family, your country, and your world. I have great doubts that whether this young generation of Americans is up to it. It's not that they're all that different from our generation, with one massive exception. The level of distraction, narcissism, and complicity is afforded much greater free opportunity to be trapped by. And that's what it is, a narcotic trap. So with human initiatives, it all starts with 1, 2, maybe a conference here at Yale, heaven forbid at Princeton, Harvard, maybe at Moreland College, maybe at Oberlin, maybe some of the smaller colleges of less repute, wherever it is, it starts. Who's going to fund it? Small contributions. Shall we start making comparisons with how much we spend on Hostess Twinkies compared to illuminating the path of justice? Who else can fund it? There are hundreds of billionaires in this country. Not all of them are narcissistic, avaricious people. Some of them are worried about their children and grandchildren and what they're going to inherit. Some of them have already funded activities to challenge corporate power, corporate corruption of our elections, money in politics, environmental depredations. 1 or 2 of these billionaires, without even feeling it, can fund this entire movement of democracy over corporatism. Now, lest you think that I left some injustices out, you're quite right. I have left injustices out. Some of them are subsumed under the phrase identity politics. And not a few of them are conditioned, enabled, facilitated, or caused by authoritarian corporatism at the root. Poverty leads to fear and hatred of others at your same level of income. It leads to desperate acts, which are fed into mass incarceration by corporate prisons, and on and on. Let me end on this note. If you want more information, is corporatecrimereporter.com. Comes out every week in Washington, D.C. corporatecrimereporter.com. You might even invite the editor, Russell Mokhyper, to speak here. He once told me he could almost have a corporate crime reporter every day, but he doesn't have quite the energy. Bloomberg Business Week chronicles corporate crimes almost every week. Hardly a radical Marxist publication. Wall Street Journal, outside its Neanderthal editorial and op-ed pages, corporate crime, time and time again. You might say, well, if the corporations control everything, how do these establishment magazines with corporate advertisements dare to do this? How does 60 Minutes dare to do this? And you know why? Because all these exposés almost go nowhere. If they actually changed things, there'd be less exposés because there'd be less advertising. And so it's kind of an embarrassing moment or two. And then the PR people develop the override, and it's business as usual, because unlike a human being who can lose their entire career with one mishap or one misdeed, corporations can commit millions of them, and it's still in business. It's still called a prestigious corporation. If you want to get my weekly column free, 7 minutes of agitation a week, go to nader.org and just sign up. I've urged thousands of my friends to do this, and when I meet them months later, they still haven't done it. That's what overload means. That's what overload of information means. Tyrants today, if they want to destroy freedom of speech and discourse, they really don't have to engage in ultimate censorship. All they have to do is study under a microscope how a paramecium behaves when it's suffocated by its own exudations. It just floods you with information of all levels, frivolity, fake, true, whatever. And we don't know how to handle it and devolve into cognitive dissonance or crawl into our corners of specialization and not look at the big picture. This conference is unique. I urge you to stay on and stay for Saturday and Sunday too, isn't it? Yes. Yes. You have people from all over the world here. They didn't come here to look at empty chairs. But you can imagine, you have a bigger hall here at Yale, and if the students were up to it, if they knew really what was going on, if they knew what they were getting into, if they knew what was coming in the next decades, zero tolerance for technological mistakes are very hard to achieve. They would fill that, what is it called, Sterling? What's the big auditorium? What? Yeah, anyway, I filled it myself once in the good old days. It has over 1,000 seats. Where are the students? Where are the faculties? Well, thank you very much. Well, I did go over my time. Is there time for questions? Is there?
Question?
Anybody challenge me?
I have a question.
Yes.
With the Congress controlled by the corporations, how do we change things?
By having Congress watch locals in every district. You start out with 10 people, 20 people, 30 people. Their agenda is well documented. It's supported by a majority of the people in the district. Many of the major changes have conservative liberal support in public opinion polls. Clean elections, liberal conservatives. So we're talking about people now, not PACs or Koch brothers. We're talking about ordinary people who have to face the same problems where they live, work, and raise their children. Ideologies tend to dissipate when you have to face that. They want their children, they all bleed the same way, they're all defrauded the same way, they're all crumbling schools and things like that. So that's the way you start it. It can be started with a few $1 million. You get organizers going out in 525 districts. We have all kinds of preliminary information on how to do it. And then you start with the summons, the book that you might have me sign today. It's a little book called Breaking Through Power. It's easier than we think. I give a lot of examples throughout history. It has a formal summons. So once you get enough people in each congressional district, you summon your senators and representatives to town meetings of your creation for agendas of your promotion. And you can't believe how few people it takes to get a senator to that town meeting because they're used to nobody showing up. So 500 people will get a senator. Just 500 people sitting in an auditorium will get a senator. That's the way to jumpstart it. And how do you motivate them? Look, we regulated the auto industry with fewer than a few dozen people around the congressional district. Why? One, everybody didn't want to get killed in cars, right? They wanted to protect their children, so we had like public sentiment behind us. Two, we had authoritative people speaking. We had former automobile industry engineers. We had medical doctors who showed that the prevention of trauma by seatbelts was better than trying to operate on a crushed skull. Three, we had reporters who covered the story. We had key allies in the House and Senate to hold widely publicized hearings. Four, the auto industry stumbled. They made stupid things like covering up recalls, putting private detectives on the tail of a critic, which was exposed, etc. And then we had the legislation through. And there were about 10 examples of that for legislation in the late 60s and early 70s. Well, now you don't have as good a Congress, right? On the other hand, we didn't have Congress watch the locals. We didn't have the internet. We had to worry about stamps and long distance calls and so forth. So it can be done. The only obstacle you got to overcome is your own self-defeatism. Your own feeling you can't fight Congress, you can't fight City Hall, why try? You have all kinds, people give all kinds of excuses to themselves. And when you talk to people, you say, what's your excuse? 1, 2, 3, 4. You just strip it away. You strip it away kindly. So they have no excuses. They have the power. The Constitution starts with we the people. It doesn't start we the corporation. It doesn't even start we the Congress. It starts we the people. Yes?
You just said...
I can't hear you. You need a PA.
You just said you succeeded against the order of don't want to get killed in a car. The GAO...
Wait, I got off a plane. My ears are clogged.
Is this any better? You just said that you succeeded against the auto industry because of a shared interest in avoiding getting killed in a car. The GAO just came out and warned the government about the costs of ignoring global warming.
Ignoring what?
Global warming.
Global warming.
Climate change. It came out yesterday, I'm sure you know. What I don't understand is that Congress must know that climate change is not a Chinese hoax, because you've got experts that testify about it. Well, all the world's scientific organizations have testified about climate change. So my question is, why is there not the same shared interest about retaining one's grandchildren that there was about avoiding getting killed in a car? I don't understand.
All right, let me try to respond. 48% of your Congress does understand. We have a winner-take-all system. We have, gerrymandering. We have electoral college, all this stuff. Anyway, so if you start with 48%, what about the rest? My guess is half the rest understand, but they're under the thumb of the leadership. The leadership has a very short range. Namely, they want to keep getting their base with them and they want to keep getting the money from the Koch brothers and all the other fossil fuel and other industries to win elections. These people are extremely myopic and ignorant. Ignorant to a level you can't believe. Senator of Oklahoma, what's his name? No, the other one.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, Inhofe. Here's an example of Inhofe. Inhofe once was asked, how do you keep winning elections? You're against, like everything. He said, simple, guns, gays, and God. So they're working on the part of the population that has been told again and again, whatever happens to the world is God's will. Don't believe those scientists. They represent special interests, Eastern universities, whatever. So they got that base. It's not a majority base, but it's a base. And the bulk of their money is coming from people who want to continue with present technologies and pollution and greenhouse gases. Plus, very short-range goals. They're not looking out 10 years, even for themselves. Plus, they got elected this way, with this message and this money. So it's a very tenuous grip on the Congress that the fossil fuel industry and others have. Now let me tell you something you probably didn't know. When I looked around Washington, I know these environmental groups. When the energy legislation, it was good legislation, passed in the House-dominated, Democrat-dominated House in 2009, this is when Obama had the White House and the House and the Senate. Huge lost opportunity. It went to the Senate, and it had a lot of renewable energy, forest preservation, all kinds of very good things in it. The Senate minority blocked it, the Republicans, because of the rules of the Senate. The Democrats aren't smart as the Republicans are in terms of parliamentary procedure. They're going to pass these huge tax escapes as part of the reconciliation bill, requiring 51 votes, not 60 votes. They bypassed the filibuster. So I scanned the environmental groups, and I asked the following question. What are you doing about Congress and climate change? The answer, Congress is hopelessly deadlocked. We're not going to waste our time. It's controlled by Republicans, one way or the other, 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15. And we're just going to work on the coal pollution regulation, try to save it, sue the EPA, sue OSHA, do these little things that we can do, that we push renewable energy. We can't deal with Congress. Now, just watch this. They wrote off the U.S. Congress. So I write a letter, joint letter to Al Gore, George Soros, and Tom Steyer. All tremendous advocates for renewable energy, climate change forewarning, policy, and so on. And I said, I don't know one full-time environmental advocate who goes up to Capitol Hill every day just focused on climate change. They got other fish to fry that they think they can get an amendment here or there. But on climate change, they're not wasting their time. I said, if you want to really change energy policy in the U.S., you can do some things at the state level. You can put down your thermostat in the winter. You can wear sweaters. You can walk instead of going to a car. But the transformation of this massive, threatening, vested technology and how it's rooted into our tax laws, etc., is going to require Congress. So why don't you get together, you, Soros, Steyer, and Gore, and get $20 million and start a full-time climate change lobby on Congress connected to all the grassroots, with 110 seasoned lawyers, public relations people, technologists, ecologists, economists, that go up to Congress every day they work. They know the staff, the members, the weaknesses, they get hearings, they connect with government procurement policy to veer toward sustainable economies, they know about budgets, they know how to feed the press. Why don't you just start with 20 million? Do you know what $20 million is to George Soros? It's what $2 is to you. He just put $18 billion into the Open Society Institute. He gets it. He's super wealthy. He gets it. He knows about authoritarianism. He grew up under communism and fascism in Hungary. He gets building institutions. He's built institutions over half the world. Al Gore, do you need to convince him? He's become super wealthy. Got in early at Google and so on. Tom Steyer, he's given politicians money who have the right policies. So what's the response? The response from their offices, I kid you not, is thank you very much. Your analysis is quite interesting, but Congress is not where the action is. It's at the grassroots. Like there's a difference. You can have all the grassroots you want. If you don't have Congress, it goes into the ether, it dissipates. So I'm trying to convey that the turnaround is easy. The turnaround is easy. We've shown it in the past, we can show it in the future. We can shrink that Inhofe base slowly by people in their communities, in their church, saying, look, this is for real. Look what's happened in the Caribbean. Look what's happened in Greenland. Look what's happened in the Andes. Look at the permafrost in Alaska. It's real. It's your temperatures in the summer. It's not just natural cyclical. Some of it is, maybe, but it's man-made. It's real. Don't you like to have your own energy on your roof? We know a lot of Southern conservatives who like solar cells now on their roof. Don't you like to be like them? Self-reliant? It's absolutely deplorable, the level of unimaginative leadership in this country. I cannot get my calls returned from Steyer. I cannot get my calls returned from George Soros. I praise him. I buy his remaindered books and give them away free. I got my call returned from Al Gore. And he threw up his hands and he told me, money controls Congress, Ralph. Do you know how powerful the Koch brothers are? I said, you know better than I. Do I have to answer you? So they have their own institution, Gore funded. It's not laser beam, back home, town meeting, up on Capitol Hill, 535 people. You can't believe how fast the turnaround is. And you don't have to wait for elections. You can change enough of them who are already there. When I went up on Capitol Hill in the 1960s, the key person I was told I had to connect with to get the auto companies regulated was Senator Warren Magnuson of Seattle. And when I said Senator Magnuson, he is the most permissive corporate lobbyist on Capitol Hill. He's the go-to guy for the maritime industry, the aerospace industry, the financial industry. Well, from 1966 to 1972, he transformed himself and became the greatest champion of consumer legislation in American history. He had his finger to the wind. He heard the rumble from the people. There isn't that rumble from the people. And that rumble from the people is not just demonstrations and rallies. It's full-time Congress watchdog groups in each congressional district. By the way, I wrote Inhofe a few weeks ago. Here's how you deal with a denier. Sent it to 24 environmental groups, no answer. I says, here's how you deal with a denier. Dear Senator Inhofe, you have bragged that the climate change people are perpetrating a hoax. You even went to Durban, where you challenged them. You challenged Al Gore, you challenged Ed Markey to debate. under my provocation. Markey wouldn't debate him. And you're a true believer. So let me ask you one question. What level of evidence and facts would you demand to be put on your table before you changed your mind and saw climate change as significantly man-made? He will never answer that question. That's the way to put him on the defensive. That's the way, in effect, saying this has nothing to do with anything but their own career. Just another corrupt politician. So you would think that they would write that letter to all the deniers. They won't do it. They're in a routine. They're in a rut. They're doing good work every day on the defensive. Once you get on a defensive mentality, you could almost never go on the offensive. I've told them, split your group in two. One part does defense, the other only does offense. Once you're on the defense, you will never go on the offense because you are feeding the offense. You're not cutting it from another angle. Did I answer your question?
I'm sorry I asked you.
But I'm telling you, it's not that hard to turn it around. Yes, sir.
Professor, thank you very much. I completely concur with the compelling talk, which is very important. I've been in Davos posters for 4 years in a row until this year, January. And I can tell you that the corporate sector has just moved to Davos poster, and they're on top, and the name is called Disruption. Thank you.
This has been a very compelling speech, and I wish, as you quite lamented, more people heard what you are saying. You obviously have been a university professor for many years. How do you get young people to have the passion that you have? The reason why I'm asking this is university campuses worldwide have moved for changes, have made changes. And I was thinking that we're probably losing the younger generation. Question is, why are we losing the younger generation? How do we get them back to have the passion that you have, to be active and be interested in their own future?
All right, first of all, do I have a mic? Okay. No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, one at a time. Our generation does not talk enough with younger people. The technology gap is as great as any other gap. And so I was taught to do what I'm doing by older people when I was young. The arm around the shoulder. You don't see that. Older generation, younger generation, they're separated hugely. We even warehouse people in nursing homes now. So you don't see the extended family to support people. You don't see that mixture. Families split, they go to California, one child goes here and there. So both the family and the civic elders are not connecting enough with their experience and wisdom. Having said that, the second answer to your comments is, has anybody here heard of social venture network? Okay, that's like 200-300 progressive corporations. Ben and Jerry's, Esprit, Patagonia. These are corporations in the, $500 million, $2 billion level sales who are miles ahead of the giant corporations. The Frontier Corporation in the US is the Interface Corporation. Anybody hear of the Interface Corporation? Okay, that's the biggest tile carpet manufacturer in the world. Atlanta, Georgia. And about 20 years ago, the CEO, Ray Anderson, went to a speech that was given by an ecologist who was also a business person. And he came back transformed. And he said to his colleagues, we're going to change this company so that in 20 or 25 years, zero pollution, 100% recycling of our carpet tiles. What are you, crazy? Every year, he cut expenses, reduced pollution, increased recycling, until cancer claimed him in 2011. Ray Anderson is the greatest CEO of our generation, hands down. He even persuaded some Walmart people that it saved them money to reduce excess packaging. Like, you have to do that? You see where the mindset is of these corporate people? That is a group that has meetings. So connect with that group. They have some companies overseas who belong to it. They have an office, they have staff. How many of you have heard of the group Patriotic Millionaires? Okay? They have a staff in Washington. The executive director lives in New Jersey. Look it up. They have an agenda that would stun you. They have an ecology agenda, a tax agenda, a pro-labor agenda. They're multimillionaires. We are not expanding what is already there to excite the young. To excite the young. And then we have to have our own programs for young children. We have to have our own TV programs or whatever to reach the grade school. Because when they're 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, they are at the peak of their idealism. They want to save the world. The toughest questions Ronald Reagan ever got was from 10-year-olds. One of them bumped into him. He was going to some meeting, and he said to President Reagan, or he was governor maybe, he said, where does the air pollution come from? Reagan said 80% comes from trees. What reporter would ever have asked Reagan, where does, and you see the direct, simple question. And that's when you want to get their idealism. When they become 10 and 11, then they become early teenagers, they've already been oriented into what's important in the world. At peak idealism. We lose it. We put them in front of screens, we throw standardized multiple choice deceptive tests in front of them. We're destroying their minds. We're killing their imagination. We're stifling their significant curiosity. So we have to have that. And again, 1%. That's what you do. Now, one thing about Social Venture Network is they talk about careers, jobs. Jobs where you make peace with the planet. You don't plunder the planet. Ray Anderson, by the way, described himself as a recovering plunderer of the earth. Great man. So they talk jobs. How many of you have ever heard the Better World Club? Okay, that's the environmental version of AAA, Motor Club. It's got 35,000 members. Why go to AAA? They can get your car towed. They can do everything AAA does. And they are pushing for renewable energy. They are very progressive in their consumer policies. It's out of Portland, Oregon. So you take what already exists, you see? You expand it. Patagonia. Patagonia wants to use industrial hemp, but it's illegal in this country to grow it and to refine it and get the right machinery. You can import it from Canada and China, Romania, but you can't let our farmers grow because it's on the DEA prescribed list. Medievalism. The last thing a marijuana grower wants next door is a farmer with 1/3 of 1% THC industrial hemp to cross-pollinate. So Patagonia, very, very progressive company. He's written a book called Corporate Responsibility. Yvon Chouinard. You can't believe how ahead of the Chamber of Commerce, ExxonMobil, these people are. Why aren't they getting more publicity? They have their shortcomings. They don't know how to toot their horn. Well, maybe some people that we know do know how to toot their horn. But you see, you build on what you already have. And it doesn't take that much more, 1%. Yes? Why don't you come down? We have to have time for Jim Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Nader. My name is Steve Bott, and I do policy work for the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which represents 76 members of Congress in the House. I wanted to ask you about a left-right alliance on areas where there may be even less kind of material interest from the broad sector of business leaders. In particular, things like, for example, I know that the Koch brothers, while really regressive on these kinds of concerns around planetary, climate change, on ending incarceration, mass incarceration, increasing civil liberties, and kind of ending the kind of persecution of nonviolent drug offenders. They've been pretty outspoken and have actually put their money where their mouth is by investing in that. Another domain where I've been kind of involved in a left-right coalition is around an unauthorized war that was initiated by President Obama, which is the war in Yemen alongside Saudi Arabia, which has led to the largest humanitarian disaster in the world. In that instance as well, I've actually been approached by staff directors at the Koch Institute because they are interested in trying to curtail unauthorized aggression. So I think in both of those instances, there's not a kind of a broad business opposition. May even be interesting spaces to push more aggressively on right now as a precursor for building the muscles for more sustained left-right partnerships on areas that are going to be steeper mountains to climb. Thanks.
Well, you take it where you find it, on issue by issue. You disagree with the Koch brothers on 90%. They agree with you on criminal justice reform. Why not work with them on that? I wrote a book on this recently. It's called Unstoppable, the Emerging Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State. And that's one of the areas. Criminal justice reform has passed for juvenile justice reform in 15 states with conservative and liberal legislators banding together. So, you don't just say, I don't like this person's position on X, but he agrees with me or she agrees with me on Y, I'm not going to work with him. What about the victims you're trying to help, right? So you don't want to engage in that categorical level of indulgence. But you have to be careful about it. You have to be careful that when you have the left-right alliance, you're not cutting the mustard. You're saying, here's my position. If you are onto it, fine, we'll work together. But I'm not going to go with 28% corporate tax when I wanted 35% and you want 20. That kind of alliance won't work. So you might want to read that book, which, by the way, I sent to members of the Progressive Caucus, which never returns our calls. And I got to have your card because you'll be the first person to do that.
Okay.
I once sent them a corporate reform article I wrote for The Nation right on what they want. And I never got a single comment or response. I was invited years ago to talk to them. 3 out of 70 showed up with 5 staff. And so now I say something you're not going to like. Give me 4 Tea Party members of the Freedom Caucus in the House, and I will beat the entire Progressive Caucus in terms of energy levels. They don't have the energy levels. They're too obeisant to Pelosi and Hoyer, and you know better about that than I do. They don't have the energy level. If we had a foothold of 75 members of the House, we could really get something done, let me tell you. I don't expect you to comment on that.
If you'll indulge me one extra comment. I just wanted to add a little bit of color to your comment on the actual lack of barriers to entry for local organizing. On the resolution to invoke the war powers to remove U.S. forces from Yemen, which we're actively kind of collecting co-sponsors on, a Republican in Kootenai County of Idaho introduced a resolution at his local GOP council meeting. And by writing a blog about his introduction of a resolution asking for an endorsement of HCON Res 81 in the House, Raul Labrador, who represents the entire district, actually preempted the vote at that council meeting in order to get ahead of the curve. So he joined as a co-sponsor, and that county resolution went down in flames. So the county GOP ended up actually, dismantling that entire, invocation. But the fact is that, we were able to get an actual member of Congress who has a role, a constitutional duty to stand up on this. So that's the kind of level of involvement that it takes for citizens and constituents to
Good example. A lot of people don't try because they say, well, you can't get anything through, you can't get anything done. The people who win for democracy, the people who try, they don't abort themselves and stay home. It's amazing. How many examples you have to give? I have books with examples. Answer your question. This is a book designed to get young generation steamed about corporate crime. How did I do it? Well, I wrote the introduction, and then I took excerpts from corporate criminal reports in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Business Week, right? Not me, the established press, about 180 examples. And I said, keep reading all in one sitting and see when you finish whether you're steamed enough to want to join an effort to do something about it. And then it shows what that do something is about. See? And this is a technique you might want to use. If we had 1 million people who committed to 100 hours a year on their Congress and $100 a year for full-time staff in every congressional district, you could achieve this comprehensive corporate reform. How do you get it started? And here's the technique that you might want to get going. People don't want to give 100 if they don't think others are going to give 100 to achieve the goal, right? So you have to assure them that the first 999 who give 100 become the pioneers. That money is used to get 9,999 people to give 100. Those are called the founders. Some of that money is used to start corporate reform initiatives. Some of it is used to get the next 99,999 to sign the same pledge, 100 hours, $100, and they're called the drivers. And they start expanding corporate reform activity, and then they use some of that money to get the 999,000 other Americans to sign the same pledge, and they're called the critical masses. So you see, each time, you're not saying to someone, give $100, we're going for 1 million people. Well, that's a big gap, right? But if you say, no, we're just going for stage 1, we're going for 999, and we'll let you know right away, and then you can fulfill your pledge. Now, if you had that kick-started by some substantial donation of a few $100,000, you can get it going, and you'll get a left-right alliance. Let me say it again, when people, where they live, work, and raise their families, they don't become so ideological. They want their kids to have clean food, adequate health care, good education, good roads, public transit, clean air, and all the rest. And the way people are manipulated is always by abstract generalities. You know, the big orators, they're all very general. You don't come down the abstraction ladder. But once you start where people live, work, and raise their families, you get a remarkable convergence. Not 90% conservative, 90%, but you get like a total of maybe 75, 80%. That's unstoppable as a political force. But it starts with energy levels, and you got to get the younger generation angry, not wildly angry, where they lose control of themselves, but morally indignant. So this is to put information in their heads and fire in their belly. That's what's missing. You talk to 1,000 college students, and you tell them these horrors. These are horrors. People are dying. I mean, Yemenis are being slaughtered. People are being burned alive. People are starving. People are being killed by silent violence of toxic chemicals and hazardous pharmaceuticals and so on. And you tell them all this, and you say, do you deny the factual basis for this? No. They just look at you with a blank stare, as if I'm a screen on their cell phone. That's what's missing. They have access to all this information, right? On the internet. They can go to Business Week, they can go to the Wall Street Journal, they can go to the Corporate Crime Reporter. No fire in the belly. They don't have a high enough estimate of their own significance. They grew up corporate, they didn't grow up civic, they don't know history, they don't know how their forebears changed America in one area after another, who are no different than they are today. From class, race, whatever, in the 60s and 70s. They don't know history to get encouraged, to get motivated. That's our job. That's our job, your job, my job, people over 40 and 50. I don't have an email. I don't have a computer. I work on an Underwood typewriter. I don't have a cell phone. I stay on the ground. I don't like virtual reality. If I have to get something retrieved quick, I ask a friend to do it, or a relative. I don't want to get sucked in to this huge email and text message and the trivia and the recrimination and the idiocy that comes from anonymous comments. That's what is the source of a lot of this madness. Anonymous comments that were never allowed in letters to the editor in a newspaper, but are all over the internet, all over the newspaper websites. Make sure you give me your connection. Boy, he's given me a great gift. I can actually get someone in the Progressive Caucus.
His email.
No, I'll call you up.
I think we're going to have to call it time. We've got Jim Henry to hear from soon. Thank you so very much. This was